I've been taking photos for over 15 years now, and I love it just as much as I did when I bought my first DSLR. But that hasn't always been the case. In fact, around 3 years ago, I pretty much entirely stopped taking photos just for my own enjoyment. Part of the reason was that I used my camera so much as a professional photographer that when it came to using it at the weekends, it just felt like I was creating more work for myself. It wasn't strictly the act of taking photos that I didn't enjoy, but more the pressure and expectation I put on myself when it came to editing them afterwards. As any digital photographer knows, the photographic process doesn't stop when we press the shutter button. In fact, we often put more time and labor into the post-processing. Back when photography was just my hobby, this editing process was my release from my 9-to-5 job. But when photography became my 9-to-5 job, taking photos at the weekend just felt like I was working unpaid overtime. Ultimately, I didn't like feeling this way about photography, and I could see that if I carried on down this route, I would eventually fall out of love with photography entirely, which was just not an outcome that I wanted. So to avoid that happening, last year I decided to switch to film photography for my own personal work. Now, I love vintage cameras, and I also love the tones and colors created by film. So my thinking was that by making the switch to film photography, it would help in two ways. Firstly, it would eliminate the editing process entirely, and that would take away a huge part of the workload and also remove some of the pressure I'd put on myself. And secondly, going back to basics with manual focus and manual exposure settings, that would force me to be more involved with the act of actually taking photos rather than just pointing the camera at the subject and then letting the autofocus and exposure settings do most of the job for me. And this certainly did help, because film photography felt like a completely different process, and that was enough for me to be able to disconnect it from feeling like work. But there was just one issue. Whilst taking the photos, I really enjoyed taking my time with composition and also making sure that the focus and exposure settings were all correct. I would then get a buzz from hitting the shutter button because you get that nice mechanical shutter sound, and also winding on the film is super satisfying, but then nothing. I'd completely underestimated how much enjoyment I get from actually being able to review the image afterwards on a screen and just immediately reaping the fruits of my labor. Plus, my life is just so busy these days. Even after a year of taking photos on film, I've never actually gotten around to processing them, so that's good. So after realizing that film photography probably wasn't the thing for me, I ended up buying this, which is a second-hand Fujifilm X-Pro 2, and this thing has been a total game changer for me. Firstly, as some of you might already know, Fujifilm cameras offer a range of film simulation modes, which basically replicate the colors and tones of iconic Fujifilm film stock. And it does all of this in camera for you, so when you take a look at the resulting image on the back of your screen, you almost get a double dose of dopamine, because not only can you review the shots immediately, but also the color work is pretty much all done for you, and it looks good enough that you rarely need to do any additional tinkering afterwards in Photoshop. What I also love about these film simulation modes is that you can use the in-camera settings to customize them too. Now, people often refer to these as film recipes, and there are countless videos and blogs online where photographers can share their latest film recipes so that you can try them out for yourself, which makes it just a really fun experience to experiment with these different effects and find a look that suits you and your style of photography. It also creates a sense of community, which I haven't really experienced whilst owning any other brand of camera. Now, the caveat to all of this is that obviously the images you shoot are shot as JPEGs. You can obviously shoot with RAW alongside the JPEGs if you want to, but I personally didn't like the idea of having to store a ton of RAW images on hard drives somewhere, which, if I'm being totally honest, I'll probably just never do anything with them. Plus, shooting in JPEG makes the process feel a bit more like shooting with actual film, in the sense that you actually need to give more time and attention to the exposure settings you're using, because if you mess up too badly, then it's kind of just too bad. You don't have the same level of flexibility when recovering lost details in JPEG files as you do with RAW files, which ironically is the exact reason why I stopped shooting in JPEG all those years ago. And it's made me realize that over time, being so reliant on RAW images has kind of made me a little bit lazy, I guess, when it comes to some of the skills involved in taking an actual photo. Removing that safety net has forced me to pay way more attention to what and how I'm shooting, and it just provides enough of a challenge that it keeps things a bit more exciting. Will I be ditching RAW for my professional work as well? Hell no, because it's one thing to risk messing up your own personal photos, but taking the same risk with paid work isn't something I would personally be very comfortable with doing. But for a bit of fun at the weekend, I would highly recommend taking up the challenge. Now, another reason why I wanted specifically this camera, as in an X-Pro and not one of the other cameras from Fujifilm, is because I think it looks sexy.
God damn.
And before you go diving into the comments, I know you shouldn't buy something just based on its looks, because beauty's on the inside and all of that stuff. But remember, this isn't my work camera, this is my fun camera, and I wanted something that I would be excited to pick up and use every single time. Now, the way I kind of broke it down in my head was this Sony A7 Mark IV, which is the camera I use for most of my professional work, is like your day-to-day Volkswagen Golf. It's very reliable, very capable, dependable, and it does the job when it's called upon. But this X-Pro 2 is like a vintage Porsche 911 you have tucked away in the garage somewhere, and you only get it out on the weekends. And just to be clear, I don't have nearly enough money to buy a Porsche 911. It's just an analogy, but stick with me here. I mean, sure, this has racked up the mileage, and in comparison, it is a bit clunky to use, but damn is it good to look at, and it is super fun to use. I now treat my weekends as essentially photography practice, and I use it as an opportunity to just try new things out without any expectation or pressure to deliver. Whether it's testing out new film simulations or experimenting with a new type of composition, or even trying out an entirely new genre of photography. In fact, getting back that desire to go out and just take photos has recently got me into street photography, which is something I really enjoy doing now, and that's something I want to spend more time getting better at. And ultimately, the only way to get better at things in life is just to do it a lot. So having a camera that makes me excited about going out and taking photos at any given opportunity is only helping me to become a better photographer.